Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive, into a really fascinating book. It's
hmm
called N New W: How the World Made the West by Josephine Quinn.
Okay.
And we're going to be uncovering some surprisingly ancient connections that shape societies that I think we often think of as being isolated.
Yeah,
So get ready for some aha moments because this book really flips the script on how we understand history.
that's right. It
Yeah,
really does.
yeah.
Quinn really argues that the West, as we know, didn't just spring up on its own, right? It's the result of thousands of years of global interaction, a tapestry woven with threads from all over the world.
Yeah, so we're kind of ditching that textbook narrative of, ancient Greece and Rome as these self-made civilizations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Even way back in the Bronze Age,
Okay.
long before the Parthenon or the Colosseum.
Right.
Cultural exchange was already shaping these societies in ways you might not expect.
Mm-hmm.
Take the Phoenicians, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't realize they were masters of the sea long before the Greeks.
Right.
They were connecting Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean with points west, making their bustling port of Byblos a central hub.
Now here's something that might surprise you about those Phoenician sailors.
Oh, yeah.
Mastering seafaring wasn't some overnight genius move for them.
Right.
Quinn points out that for centuries their boats only had one square sail, so they were at the mercy of the wind.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine relying on oars to get across the Mediterranean when the wind wasn't cooperating?
Yeah.
Talk about patience.
Yeah, it really highlights how even the most impressive technological advancements often come from humble beginnings. It took generations of trial and error for the Phoenicians to develop the keel, which revolutionized shipbuilding and allowed them to navigate more challenging waters.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. And it wasn't just shipbuilding. Even the spread of something as basic as the wheel, and get this, the donkey, involved fascinating exchanges.
It's easy to overlook the donkey, but they were actually game changers,
Right.
especially in areas like the Eastern Sahara where wood for wheels was scarce. Donkeys were low maintenance and could thrive in tough conditions, making them essential for transporting goods. Quinn calls them the perfect low-maintenance companion.
I love that.
Yeah.
So we've got the Phoenicians sailing around, donkeys changing the game. What about the ancient Greeks? Weren't they tucked away on their islands inventing democracy and philosophy?
Not quite. The Minoans and Mycenaeans, often seen as the cradle of Western civilization, were actually very much plugged into a network heavily influenced by the Levant. They were exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies with the wider world.
So they weren't as isolated as we often think.
Exactly.
Okay.
Quinn tells this intriguing story of a Caphtarian merchant that's Cretan buying tin at the Levantine port of Ugarit.
Wow.
This shows just how far-reaching these trade networks were even back then. These societies were interconnected, not isolated.
Okay, but what about the eruption of Thera? That massive volcano that supposedly wiped out the Minoans, that seems pretty isolating and catastrophic.
It was a cataclysmic event, no doubt,
Yeah.
but Quinn challenges the idea that it single-handedly caused the Minoan collapse. She points to evidence from tephra deposits, think volcanic ash,
Okay.
and the fact that Crete continued to flourish even after the eruption.
Really?
It's a more complex story than we often hear.
So not a sudden end of civilization moment for the Minoans.
Right. The late Bronze Age collapse, as it's called, wasn't the end, but a shift in power dynamics.
Okay.
We see a move away from palaces and towards more decentralized forms of organization.
Okay.
And even in this turbulent time, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos continued to flourish.
And they were resilient because of their connections to trade.
Absolutely.
Okay.
They were adaptable and plugged into those vital trade networks, which helped them weather the storm.
It's fascinating how history repeats itself. Speaking of which, Quinn uses the story of Wenamun, that Egyptian official robbed in Byblos, to illustrate this point, doesn't she?
She does. Wiedemann's misfortune actually reveals a lot about the changing relationship between states and commerce. The king of Byblos isn't too concerned about a stolen shipment of gold, showing a shift in priorities towards trade and local autonomy. Just like today, economic shifts have a ripple effect, changing the balance of power. But let's bring it back to the Greeks.
Yes. How does all of this connect to them? Did they invent their alphabet on their own?
That's where we see even more surprising influences. The arrival of the alphabet in Greece wasn't some grand intellectual leap. They adopted it for practical reasons, to facilitate trade and communication.
Oh, Oh.
And they didn't just invent it out of thin air.
They borrowed it.
They did.
Wow.
They adapted it from a much older system used in the Levant.
Huh.
Even the building blocks of Greek culture, like their alphabet, were shaped by global exchange.
Mind-blowing. What else did they borrow?
Oh, all sorts of things. For instance, the practice of ecstatic prophecy at Delphi, with its mysterious pronouncements, has roots in traditions from the East.
Wait, even that goat shudder ritual we've all heard about?
Even that.
No way.
It has roots in Mesopotamian ritual, believe it or not.
It's like a cultural remix, taking elements from different sources and blending them into something new.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about Quinn's work. She challenges us to look beyond the traditional narratives and see the interconnectedness of human history. She even talks about how Greek myths themselves were reshaped to incorporate new people and places they encountered, like the Etruscans in Italy.
So those epic tales weren't just about heroes and gods, they were reflecting real-world interactions and cultural exchanges.
Exactly.
This is all so eye-opening, and we've only just scratched the surface of Quinn's book. Okay, so we've journeyed through ancient seafaring, low-maintenance donkeys, and even goat shudder rituals. What other surprises await us in Quinn's exploration of how the world made the West?
Well, get ready for empires, because Quinn's next section dives into the rise of these massive powers and the encounters they sparked. We're starting with the Assyrians, known for their military might, but also their fascinating approach to cultural exchange.
When I think of the Assyrians, I think military power, not necessarily cultural exchange. What did they do?
They had this policy of mass relocation, and I'm not talking about a few families here and there. We're talking over 1 million people forcibly moved across their vast empire. Imagine the impact on those individuals.
Wow.
Uprooted from their homes and thrust into new cultural landscapes.
That's a staggering scale.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine. It must have had a huge effect on mixing different cultures, right?
Absolutely. Quinn argues that while this policy was undeniably brutal, it also led to the spread of knowledge, skills, and traditions.
Okay.
Think about it. Ironworking, viticulture, new architectural styles, all of these spread throughout the Mediterranean, partly driven by these forced migrations and the trade routes that followed.
So it's a complex story, as history often is, with both positive and negative consequences stemming from this one policy. Quinn does a great job of highlighting those nuances.
She really does.
Right.
And to illustrate this cultural blending, she brings up the intriguing example of the menhirs of Iberia. These are standing stones, and initially they seem to be mimicking ancient burial practices. But over time, they start incorporating Mediterranean goods and even adopt the upright forms found in Levantine cultures.
Interesting.
It's a fascinating example of how cultural ideas travel and transform over time.
It's like those ideas themselves were on a journey.
Okay, so we've got the Assyrians shaking things up. What about the Persians? They were known for their vast empire, but also for being more tolerant of diverse cultures.
Yes.
Yes.
The Persian Empire was like a melting pot of cultures and traditions.
Right.
Quinn highlights the role of women in Persian society, bringing in figures like Queen Artemisia.
Okay.
She actually commanded a naval contingent at the Battle of Salamis.
That's right. Artemisia was a total powerhouse. And it's interesting how Quinn contrasts Persian attitudes toward women with those of the Greeks. That's a really important point. The Greek historian Herodotus observed that Persian women had more freedom than their Greek counterparts.
Really?
They could conduct business, own property, and even travel more freely.
Yeah.
This really highlights the diversity of cultural norms that existed even within these empires that we tend to lump together with one label.
It's a good reminder that there's no such thing as a single monolithic ancient world. It was made up of so many different cultures, each with its own unique values and practices. Of course, we can't talk about the Persian Empire without talking about Alexander the Great.
Absolutely not. Alexander's conquest of Persepolis, and particularly the symbolic burning of its palace, marks a massive shift in power. It's a dramatic turning point, signaling the end of an era and the start of something new.
And with Alexander, we move into the Hellenistic era, a time of even greater cultural fusion. Plus, new centers of learning and exchange emerge. It feels like the pace of connection is picking up.
It really is. And Alexandria, founded by Alexander himself, becomes this shining example of a cosmopolitan center of knowledge. The city's famous library, with its vast collection of scrolls, attracted brilliant minds from all over the known world.
Can you imagine the conversations that must have happened within those walls? It must have been a whirlwind of ideas. Quinn talks about some amazing projects that came out of this cultural melting pot, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most significant examples is the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek by Jewish scholars.
Okay.
This project, known as the Septuagint, wasn't just about language. It was driven by the need to preserve Jewish knowledge and make it accessible in a rapidly changing world. This translation continues to have an impact even today, influencing later translations and bridging cultural divides across millennia.
That's incredible to think that a project from this ancient world of cultural exchange still resonates with us today. But the connections don't stop there, do they? Quinn also challenges this idea we have of Rome being solely a product of Greek influence.
She does. While the Greeks certainly played a role, Quinn points to the influence of Mesopotamian legal traditions on Roman law. It's fascinating because it shows how seemingly distant cultures could have this profound impact on each other.
So we've got Mesopotamian legal traditions influencing the Romans. That's not something you learn in your average history class. It really shows how much more there is to these connections than we often realize. But the Romans weren't just borrowing from others, were they?
Not at all. As they expanded, they brought their own cultural influences to the table.
Right.
Quinn talks about the adoption of the Spanish sword, a double-edged weapon that changed Roman warfare. We also see the rise of Latin literature, often written by people who were enslaved from conquered territories. It was a two-way street of cultural influence, shaping both the Roman world and the lands they interacted with.
Quinn even brings these connections right to Britain.
She does, yeah.
She points to archaeological finds like the Ivory Bangle Lady, a woman buried in York with all these exotic goods. Then there's the fact that pepper from India has been found in Roman archaeological sites all over Britain. It really shows how global trade impacted even the most everyday aspects of life.
It's amazing to think that even back then, people were spicing up their meals with pepper from across the world. It makes you realize how connected they were to a much larger network of exchange. But of course, even the Roman Empire couldn't last forever.
Right. Quinn wraps up this part of the book by talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. She reminds us that Europe was never an easy region to hold on to, even for them.
Yeah, and it really drives home the point that even the most powerful empires aren't invincible.
Right.
Change is a constant, and empires rise and fall. But what follows the fall of an empire is just as fascinating. New networks emerge, and perhaps no force was as transformative as the rise of Islam.
Okay, so let's talk about Islam. It's often presented through the lens of conquest, but Quinn highlights its role in preserving and spreading knowledge, doesn't she?
She does. The translation movement, which flourished under the Abbasid Caliphate, saw scholars translating works from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources into Arabic, preserving ancient wisdom that might have otherwise been lost. Thinkers like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, made groundbreaking contributions to math, astronomy, and geography. Their work traveled across borders and centuries, influencing European thought later on.
It really speaks to that interconnectedness Quinn emphasizes throughout the book. Knowledge doesn't stay confined to one culture, it flows across borders carried by scholars, travelers, merchants. Speaking of travelers, we have to talk about the Silk Road. It's become this iconic image of global exchange, but Quinn throws us a bit of a curveball there, doesn't she?
She does. We often picture the Silk Road as this one, single road across land. But Quinn points out that the idea of it as a clearly defined road is a bit of a modern invention. While overland routes were definitely important, sea routes and the Indian Ocean trade network were absolutely crucial in connecting the East and West.
So instead of just camels crossing the desert, we should be picturing bustling ports, ships laden with goods, sailors navigating by the stars.
Exactly. Quinn brings these maritime connections to life, describing cosmopolitan cities like Cordoba and Palmyra, where diverse cultures met and mingled. These weren't just trade hubs, they were melting pots of ideas, languages, and art.
And it's through these intricate networks that things like Arabic numerals made their way to Europe, right?
That's right. Think about how elegant and efficient those numerals are compared to Roman numerals. They revolutionized math and science in the West, but their adoption was surprisingly slow. Even a good idea can take time to catch on.
Which makes you wonder what other game-changing ideas might be out there right now, just waiting for their moment. It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. It's more like a winding path with unexpected detours. And sometimes those detours involve, well, the Mongols.
Ah, yes, the Mongols. Known for their conquest, but they actually had a huge impact on trade across Eurasia.
It's strange to think that a group known for conquest could inadvertently connect the world even further.
It just goes to show that history is full of surprises and unintended consequences. Their vast empire, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, opened up new trade routes and facilitated an exchange of goods and ideas on a scale rarely seen before. But greater interconnection, as we know, can also have its downsides. And the spread of the Black Death is a stark example of that.
That's right, the Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in history, traveled along those very same trade routes. A grim reminder that global exchange can have both positive and negative consequences.
Absolutely. And Quinn brings us all the way to the fall of Constantinople and the subsequent rise of the Ottoman Empire, marking a seismic shift in global power. These are all pivotal moments that have shaped the world we live in today.
So as we come to the end of this deep dive, what are the key takeaways from New W, How the World Made the West? What should we be carrying with us?
The biggest takeaway, I think, is a challenge to rethink how we view history. It's not a simple linear progression with the West at the top. It's a complex, interconnected web of exchange and influence, with threads connecting every corner of the globe. The West, as we know it, is a product of this long, intricate history of interaction, borrowing, and adaptation.
It's a powerful message, especially in a world that often feels so divided. Quinn reminds us that we're all part of a shared story, a story that's still being written.
And that leads to a really interesting question for you to think about. How might we understand current events differently if we viewed them through this lens of long-term global interaction? What connections are we overlooking if we cling to those outdated narratives of isolation and exceptionalism?
It's a question worth pondering as we navigate the complexities of our world today. This deep dive into Quinn's book has been eye-opening, and I hope it sparked your curiosity as well. What other surprising connections are out there waiting to be discovered in our shared history? The journey of exploration never really ends. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into NUW, How the World Made the West. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and until next time, happy learning.